So, racism and its assorted forms that we talk about. What is racism? If I sit here and I tell you that racism is discriminatory feelings or actions against an individual who you feel inferior, I'm not telling you anything new. I don't think we need to have a conference about that. I think I want to jump right to what's considered step 2 in this discussion, which is that racism is not only a matter of personal racism, but it's also a matter of what was once called societal racism. After that, the renewal of the term was institutional racism. Today, we're encouraged to call it white supremacy. All three of those terms mean the same thing: societal racism, institutional racism, white supremacy. The idea being that it's not only a matter of somebody drawing something on a wall or somebody calling someone a dirty name or not allowing someone to become a lawyer, but that we have a system in this country where there are disparities in the achievements of people that correlate with race, and that the reason for that is racism, and that that's the kind of racism that we need to be focusing on. Now, racism 101, as in discrimination, hatred of others. I think we all agree we don't need to think about whether or not that's a bad thing. And it needs to be battled, most certainly, including the sorts of things that have happened on this campus recently, including what happened to Tamir Rice, including that if a black person is in a doctor's office, often a doctor subconsciously thinks that black people tolerate pain more easily than white people. These things need to be not just talked about, but battled. However, if we're talking about racism in a broader sense, if we're anxious to say, as many people are, that no, it's not just that kind of racism, which frankly is kind of easy, but also institutional racism that we need to battle, I'm really worried about how we use that term these days. I think that our use of the term institutional racism is counterproductive, and I don't just mean that it makes people angry. I mean that it ends up denying people who've been left behind the help that they need, and this is why. Institutional racism. It refers to the fact that there are disparities in society, that black people have less of various things than white people. I'm oversimplifying and saying that it's only about black and white, but I'm sure you understand why. So, that's the issue. Now, I'll say that to call person-to-person racism and institutional racism variations on the same thing is very dangerous. It's counterproductive in the way that I mentioned. And some people will say, well, no, when we say institutional racism, it's an extended use of the word racism. What we're referring to is the disparities. That's different from something being written on a wall. So it's a different kind of racism. Maybe we're calling it racism, but we know that it's not the same thing. But no, you don't. You don't. That's actually not true, because the issue is that there are these disparities in society because of racism, ultimately of the person-to-person kind. The idea isn't that the disparities in society are by chance, clearly, and if it's not that it's by chance, what else is it supposed to be? It's racism. And it's not that institutional racism is because of something as faceless as institutional racism. The idea is that institutional racist disparities are due in some way, either in the past or the present, but mostly the present, to racist discrimination against human beings that has some kind of aggregate effect. So what that means is that when we say institutional racism, it triggers the same brain responses as saying just racism. If you want an analogy, think about implicit association tests, where we learn that someone shown a black face is more likely to think of words like angry and ignorant than if they're shown a white face. These things are often subconscious, such as racist bias. We all understand that? Same thing with the terms societal racism and institutional racism. What we think of is just racism. And so this is why that's a problem. If we hear those terms and we think, therefore, that our job is to respond with the same gut, with the same parts of the brain, with the same sometimes almost unconstructive indignation as we respond to one-to-one racist discrimination. This is the problem with it. It's not just that it's messy or that I don't like it for some random reason. It means that poor black people don't get less poor. So this is the nut of what I'm going to say, and I'm not going to talk for too long. There are two things. There's battling racist discrimination, which is one of the evils of the human condition, and we should lessen it as much as we can. But then there's also political activism. There's helping people who've been left behind. And you're often taught, especially you, that battling this is the same thing as battling that. And it's not. And I'm going to put it in a very specific way. Unequal outcomes do not always stem from unequal opportunity. They don't. I almost wish they did, because then our job as people interested in changing society would be easier. But life is almost never easy. Unequal outcomes do not always stem from unequal opportunity due to racism. Let's add that codicil. They don't. In fact, they usually don't. I know a lot of you don't want to hear it, but I'm sorry, it's true. And that means that we need to get rid of that simplistic sense that if there are disparities, they're due to something we would call racism and deserve the same kind of response that we would give to a swastika on the wall. And the reason we don't want that is because it leaves people poor. What the hell is he talking about? This. Let's say that there is a lousy inner city school. Most of the students in it are black or Latino. Nobody does much learning. Now, we're conditioned today to say that that's racism that's creating the conditions of that school. And so what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate racism, and that'll make the school better. No, that's not why that school is such a lousy place. Now, starting in the 1960s, that school started to become lousy after having been a good one for a long time because of white flight from the neighborhood, which ended up eating the property tax base. That was racism, but it was 50 and 60 years ago. If we're talking about now here in 2019, the question is whether eliminating racism will fix that school. We can't go back to 1959. So what's doing in the school now? It's much more complicated than racism. I wish it weren't, but it is. And if we want to help the children in that school, we've got to think more largely than being an anti-racist. The reason being, not that Ibram Kendi's book isn't interesting, but because we want to help those children in the school and their parents. So, what's wrong with the school? One thing that's wrong with the school, which today is run by black people, which is another chink in the idea that racism is the issue. But it's run by black people, and education schools are what taught most of the teachers there. And since about 1969, most education schools in the United States don't teach teachers how to teach. Instead, they often teach teachers about liberal and leftist ideology, and they explicitly tell teachers that their job is to teach children how to see the world as a good-hearted political activist. Now, that comes from a good place in the heart, but a lot of those teachers, through no fault of their own, have been grievously undertrained by an education school orthodoxy that is extremely anti-racist. The people who run these schools think of themselves as fighting the good fight, but it means that they're teachers who forget that they don't know how to keep order. They don't know how to teach anybody how to read. They don't know how to teach anybody math. I have a very snooty voice. I am not criticizing the teachers. They can't help it. The ed schools let them down. But that is a much larger percentage of why that school doesn't work than that somebody doesn't like black people. Or another reason that school doesn't work is because most of the kids come from homes where they only had one parent. Now, that can work, but it's pretty clear that it's better for there to be two parents around in some way. But really, with most of those kids, there's no dad. Where's dad? Dad's in jail. Why is dad in jail? Probably because of something having to do with drugs. Why is he in jail? Because of something having to do with drugs? Because there's a ridiculous war on drugs that puts people up the river for long periods of time for reasons that don't make any sense. All of that started in the late 60s and was reinforced in the early 90s, this war on drugs. Now, your impulse is to say racism, especially with this whole business of Kamala Harris dumping on Joe Biden, et cetera, lately. No, no, no. In the late 60s, and especially in the early 90s, those drug laws were heartily espoused by very black people, including the ones living in communities where these sorts of activities were going on and making life difficult, including many members of the Congressional Black Caucus who don't quite know what to say about it now. We don't have crystal balls. We can't know what's going to happen. But these draconian drug laws, which are a terrible thing, were something that a lot of serious race people were behind. You're not told that very much, and I understand why, so I'm telling you. And what that means is that the war on drugs that has helped make it so hard to keep order in a school like that is not something you can simply dismiss as racist, even if some of the people who formulated it were somewhat. You can find some evidence of that. Black people liked the war on drugs. So I think that if you're going to make black people less poor, then one thing you need to do is devote all of your heart and soul to eliminating the war on drugs. For those of you who are under a certain age, if you haven't done it yet, watch The Wire. Watch especially the first and the third seasons of The Wire and watch what the war on drugs does to black communities and see what you need to fight. And it is not how white people feel about black people. It's that law. Now, let's pull the camera back out. I'm talking about that school. So you look at that school and you see all these black people being screwed over by a bad education and you think that's racist. No, that's oversimplified. It's so oversimplified that you end up not being in a position to help the kids in the school. That's why we need to be careful of the way we think about institutional racism and the usage of that term. Now, there are a couple quick examples. You can have a grand old time, this has been the fashion since about 2013, of teaching white people to acknowledge their privilege. Because, yeah, you whites in the audience, you are privileged. You certainly are, and I hope you know it. But this business of white people with their hands up in the air as if they're in church talking about how privileged they are, what that creates is that. I've been watching that happening for 6 years and I don't see anything changing. It creates that. And in the meantime, talk about that school. What a lot of those kids need is to be taught, you're going to be bored for a second. They need to be taught to read via phonics instead of the whole word method. I'm sorry that sounds so inconsequential, but that is something that's being done to especially kids from bookless homes who are disproportionately children of color. Every day they're being taught to read by just looking at the whole word and guessing, which is something that really doesn't work if you're not raised in a print-rich environment. That is something that ed schools are taught, and they're taught it as a kind of social justice because it's better for dark-skinned kids to learn to be creative. Okay. Talk about what racism kind of is. But if you agitate for that school to use phonics instead of the whole word method to teach kids to read, I've seen it. It's available for you to see online how that turns a school upside down within 2 or 3 years, right there. If you can't read, then you're not going to be good at math, and next thing you know, you're in jail, to be rhetorical. You need to espouse phonics. But that doesn't get as much attention as being an anti-racist, et cetera, because it lacks the drama. But we're not supposed to be interested in drama. We're supposed to be interested in changing people's lives. So we have people attesting to their white privilege while kids are being taught to read badly. That's injustice right there. Or, we have the latest celebrity who says something tacky about race. Sometimes it's the president. And we have to talk about that for 2 weeks. And we have to talk about how racism always rears its ugly head. Blah, 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 blah. Now, in the meantime, there are long-term acting reversible contraceptive devices. They should be available free to any woman who wants them, especially poor women. Poor women are disproportionately black. No, I'm not talking about eugenics. Black women like these devices. They actually agitate for more. There are 3 thorough academic studies that demonstrate that. 5 years, you don't have to worry about anything that you're doing, but you have a child when you want one. A lot of entrenched poverty is based on issues of family planning. They're called LARCs, L-A-R-C. Not exciting, I know, that's not as exciting as talking about racism, but more LARCs would mean happier and more successful black people. We should talk about that. Phonics, LARCs. If you want some excitement, battle the war on drugs. That's exciting. Battle that. It can be done. It's already melting. You know, the attitudes about marijuana are changing. The idea is for attitudes about, yes, cocaine and heroin and everything else to change. It would turn Black America upside down. But instead, we are taught that our job is to think about institutional racism and to be upset about it and to battle racism as if this kind of racism were the same thing as inequities in society. Societal inequities that are based on race do not usually trace to racism in the sense that we know it. And anybody who tells you that is oversimplifying. Now, quick sidebar. Talking about this kind of racism, this kind of open discrimination, it must be battled, but to an extent, depending on what kind we mean. I would like to say that there's an extent to which if somebody calls you a dirty name or scrawls something on a wall, your job is to look down on that person. Your job is not to look at that and pretend injury. I've been called a nigger a couple times, and as far as I was concerned, it meant that I was superior. The minute it came out of that person's mouth, I thought, I'm better. And I walked away. As I got a little older, I realized that I was supposed to fall down on the bed and cry and start talking about slavery. No, that would make me a weak person. And I'm a person of ordinary strength. Notice, I'm not telling you, be strong. I'm telling you, be yourselves. You're being taught to pretend that you're weaker than you are. If somebody scrawls something on a wall, think about what an ugly, pick-nosed piece of shit that person is, and move along. Now, if somebody is hurting you, it's different. I'm not talking about somebody abusing you physically. Of course, there's a where do you draw the line in terms of how often this sort of abuse is going to come. But if we're talking about those passive, quiet sorts of things every now and then, when I was in college, which was not that long ago at this point, well, if somebody scrawled something on the wall, you just thought, bastard, and you moved on. That did not make it a different time. There was color then. It was just like now. Everything was in color. There was sex. It was not 1917. And yet, that is the way we thought of it, and it is the way people should think of it now. Don't let anybody, adult or child, lower you to pretending to be hurt. That's a sidebar. Now, I'm going to wrap up. The upshot of all of this is, I want you to take away 3 things, because 3 is the magic number. Unequal outcomes are not always due to unequal opportunity due to race. I think all of you understand what I mean on a gut level, but we're taught that when it comes to the descendants of African slaves, we're supposed to suspend our sense of judgment and logic. I think that that's a terrible idea. And I know that a lot of black people have learned to hear something like that and take it as a compliment. The idea being that it's somehow advanced to think of a cry of weakness as a form of strength. That starts roughly with Stokely Carmichael in 1966. It is not the way race activism has to be. It wasn't the way race activism was before then. And it's a detour. Weakness is not strength. Second thing, I have oversimplified nothing. So I know that that will be one of the criticisms, that I'm oversimplifying. But what do you mean? Do you mean that I haven't done a recitation of the horrors of racism? Because I can do it. I can say Tamir Rice, I can say the hospital office, I can talk about car insurance discrepancies with the same sorts of people. I can give you a whole recitation of all of those things, but I'm not here to give you a liturgy. This isn't church. I'm here to tell you how I think we might go about making life better for poor black people, not to mention poor Latino people. My recitation of those horrors does not create that. We are not in church. So, if I've oversimplified, then you need to think back to what I said about that inner city school, and whether you agree with what I said, I wasn't oversimplifying. I was trying for a bit of detail and nuance. So, make sure that oversimplify isn't really a synonym for just that you don't agree. I'm not being simplistic. And third, this is something I want you to remember, because it's true. If you pretend to accept that unequal outcomes are always due to unequal opportunity, and you let that kind of reasoning pass when you wouldn't let it pass in any other discipline or endeavor that you're engaged in, if you think that that kind of reasoning is somehow plausible and permissible when it comes to black people, then quite unintentionally, you're being racist. I mean it. I'm going to finish it by saying it one more time because I'm not pulling that back. I mean exactly what I said. If you accept that unequal outcomes are always due to unequal opportunity based on racism, knowing full well on some level that that's a kind of reasoning that you wouldn't apply anywhere else in your life, whatever color you are, you're being a racist. Thank you.
You got a mic.